Hello and welcome, Exiles, to my Energy Blade Inquisitor build guide. This will cover everything from the starting campaign into your early map progression, showcasing a character and an early gear set, as well as going over a early transition gear set for Ivory Tower in both Mine variation, which is a tristack version, a cast on crit variation, which is a lot of fun, and a self-cast version. All of these are endgame viable and quite scalable. And on top of that, you can use pretty much whatever skill you want. It really doesn't matter all that much. Certain spells are stronger than others, but the character is so overtuned you can make virtually anything do damage. As you see here, Soul Run of the Spiral kills things. Blazing Salvo can kill things. It doesn't really matter what you use. You can do damage with this build and make it work. One of the biggest downsides of this is it will give you the feeling of, man, if I want to play a skill, you're going to start to second guessing, why am I not just doing it as Energy Blade Inquisitor? It's that good. We'll also cover an endgame version of the build, just showcasing cast on crit because that's the one I quickly set up. Self-cast and mines also can scale very well into the endgame, but cast on crit is the one version I put together. And quite frankly, I only spent about 10 minutes on it, putting the rough tree together, and I didn't particularly min-max the planning. I just wanted to showcase, hey, late game, you don't have to be Ivory Tower. You can swap into a Mage Blood. If you want to Giga invest in this thing, you can make it a really fun character that's just an all-rounder of speed, damage, and tank. Now getting into the POB. I, as always, have a progression from all the way from early Act 1, the rough tree, along going all the way up to your initial early map setup. And then we have hey, if you're going to level 90 before you get to Ivory Tower, before you get that initial 5-10D of gearing, this is something you could do. I have both a non-crit and a crit variation. Quite frankly, I didn't get enough time to fully test whether or not crit or EO would be better, one or the other. It kind of just depends on your gear level, I think. The better your gear is with strength in it, the better that crit becomes. Or if your gear is more on the scuff side, EO is probably decent to keep. I will say, when looking at these two variations, it's not something you're trying to stay here for a very long time. The initial gear sets required to go into any three of these variations is pretty low, so you should be prioritizing getting that initial few divines of currency, buying the key pieces, and swapping as soon as possible, because ultimately, this stuff right here, the initial setup when you're going through maps, it's okay. It gets you through the maps. It gets you farming your first few divs. But ultimately, the jump up in power, the power spike you hit when you get to the initial Ivory Tower swap is insane. On pretty much all three of these versions, you're pushing multi-million DPS and fairly decent tank and recovery to go with it, and they just feel amazing. Personally, I like the cast on crit setup the most so far on the playtesting, but I gotta be honest, self-cast Flame Blast felt pretty good as well, and previously I always did Hex Blast Mines. That was the one we made a build guide for last league. They all work pretty well. That being said, I will include in the description the old PUB guide for the go straight to Sanctum angle. Just so you know, they did nerf Sanctum. We don't know by how much. It might still be worth on day one. I'm kind of hesitant to think so. Ultimately, Sanctum was barely a best in slot day one strategy, in my opinion. Going to maps and doing raw currency strategies, getting your Atlas filled out, pushing towards those high tier maps generally was very competitive, and it ends up being just better once you start considering Faustus. So all in all, I would say just go to maps, and that's why I prepared this version for you, going to that initial, just seeing how could it feel to start Energy Blade, which I did do a leveling stream for. If you go to the notes in the description of, or sorry, not in the description, the notes section of the POB, you'll notice I have linked a VOD here, this one right here, which will link you to a stream we did, which is, let's see if it actually nerfed the correct place. At the start of the stream, we did a leveling run, and it was about a 4-hour campaign run where I did straight up, I just went to Energy Blade as soon as I got the skill, or as soon as I got Battle Mage, so Act 3 when I did my first lab. Once I had Battle Mage, plus a few random pieces of, SSF, ES gear, I put those on, and I played with that through the campaign, and it felt fairly good, and it was fine to just go straight into maps. The thing is, as always, I have recommended early options that are just super cheap, so you can get your gearing and get the character rocking and rolling, but you want to save up and start farming currency for getting the swap over to the Ivory Tower setup immediately. Now, one thing I skipped past, but I want to go over specifically is, should you play this build, going over a bit of the pros and the cons of the character. The biggest pro I'd say of playing a character like this is the adaptability. Energy Blade, the skeleton is very strong and very generic. It gives you a bunch of flat lightning, it attaches a bunch of percent spell damage, and it gives you a bunch of generic crit. What that ends up meaning is you can click pretty much any spell in the game and it's going to do damage. Some spells are just better than others. Flame Blast's Celerity does a ton of damage. It's a very good self-cast skill. Just basic arc self-cast is going to do a lot less damage, but ultimately, there's so much scaling here that you can make almost anything work, and it's kind of dealer's choice about what you like or what aesthetics you want to your build, or maybe you are going to target specifically doing clear speed versus a boss farmer. That is up to you. It has very good adaptability, and it's pretty much just swapping gems. It's not even like changing your tree for the most part. Granted, if you want to swap from doing cast on crit to self-cast or self-cast to mines, that's going to require a tree swap, but if you're within one of those versions of the build, you can just swap in gems and out, in and out, and just play. And it has very strong on its initial 5 to 10D. When you get this first Ivory Tower gear setup, the power level is, I think, one of the best pound for pound in the game in terms of how strong it is defensively and offensively. Hopefully I showcase that today with the various setups. I have all of them in game set up on different characters. I did that so we could actually give you a real showcase, not just be POB warrioring and say, hey, look at my DPS. No, I actually have in-game examples of this. Cons: it has to play Coruscating Elixir. This build requires this initially while you have Ivory Tower. You're going to be on Ivory Tower a long time because Ivory Tower is insanely strong. The downside is basically you have to remember to press a button at the start of the zone. For the most part, this is not a big deal. You start getting, it becomes second nature. You don't even think about it. But occasionally you'll randomly die and be like, I forgot to click the flask. I died to chaos damage. And then very rarely, and I almost never have this happen to me, but let's say you try to force in a bunch of tormented rogue exiles on your maps. I wouldn't recommend this strategy with this build until you swap out of Ivory Tower Coruscating. But there is a very rare torment mod which can downright just turn off your flask. Very rare to run into, but if you're doing a strategy that does a lot of torment stuff, then you start running into it. Next up is it has a decent amount of map mods that are auto skips. For example, it's an ES build. You can't run less defense because less defense not only hurts your ES, but it also hurts your damage. Technically, depending on how geared your character is, you might be so overgeared that even taking a bad mod like this is okay, but that depends. There's other things like remove 5% life on hit. This will PK a low life build, just auto kills low life builds. That's just how this mod works. So there's a decent amount of mods where it's just like, you can't run them because they're just directly counter your character. This depends on what build you're playing. Some builds get around more map mods than others, but I just want to make a note of it because there's definitely a decent amount of map mods that are like, I don't really want to do that. That's annoying. And I only had enough time to do a little bit of a brief testing on the early map progression. I will showcase the early progression character. I have that set up as well, but I didn't get the time to test out between EO versus crit, depending on that early state before you swap to the initial Ivory Tower gearing. So I can't promise it'll be insane performance on the initial gearing in terms of farming that first few divines. I think it'll be decent enough. I'll showcase and you can make your own judgments. And another random side note, and this is something that you may not believe me on, but I think if you play the character, you'll come to realize this, which is this type of character will make future characters feel weak. And what I mean by that is when you start considering playing other spell-based characters, you're going to think, oh, would this just have been better with Energy Blade? And the answer is usually yes. There's a few exceptions. For example, the Sabo change direction node, which works with Rolling Magma. Rolling Magma specifically will be probably best in slot on a Sabo because of that node, which specifically utilizes that skill. But for the most part, pretty much every hit-based spell in the game, even including Archmage in a lot of variations, I think Energy Blade will be stuck in your mind and you'll think this would have been better if I just played it as Energy Blade. So keep that in mind if you don't want to have this mental brick going forward. I've had this for a while where it feels bad to click spell builds and play anything but Battle Mage, E-Blade, and Quiz because it's just so strong. That is an issue that you might find in the future. So if you want to keep your E-Blade virginity and your ability to play spell builds another way, you might want to consider that caution. Now, another thing, skill gem setups to try on this build. I went through a few options that are very good. Ultimately, as I said before, you can take pretty much any hit-based skill you want and make it do damage. Some are just better than others. For example, you'll notice on both the cast and crit options and the mine options, I reference Eye of Winter as one of the best single target skills. The reason for this is it's a skill that, and it has slow cast speed, so it doesn't perform as well on self cast, whereas cast on crit and mine options don't care about the base cast speed. but this is one of those skills where it hits a ton and just does a lot of damage, and you don't really need any specialization in your build for it to work well. You don't need any special investment. For example, things like Bladefall, it needs Awakened Cascade to be good. It's something you can't really do till later, but it felt pretty good on Cast on Crit when I had Awakened Cascade. Another example is Ice Spear of Splitting with Cast on Crit. Feels fantastic with the return proj and stuff, but I'm not sure it would feel very good on self-cast or mine options. You can always test them out and see what you think, but these are just some options I gave here, and I'm going to showcase some of them in game so you can see for yourself. But ultimately, just think of this as suggestions and try stuff for yourself to see what you like personally. As for the progression of this character, we have the campaign guide, which just showcases how to do a run. Initially, you can either go for Energy Blade right away, or if you find a high flat elemental weapon, you can equip that as well and wait a little bit on Energy Blade. Ultimately, Energy Blade plus the ES gear you get throughout the campaign as you upgrade it will keep giving you fairly decent damage when considering Spellblade support and Battle Mage. Both of those stack at... Oh, I should probably cover this real quick while I'm thinking about it, because it's something I'm going to forget to later on. Why is Energy Blade and Battle Mage and Quiz so good? It is because of a few key factors, and that specifically has to do with Battle Mage, Spellblade support. Those two things stack additively. So what ends up happening is you turn your character into a build that has a bunch of flat ES. So for example, I'll take this character. This is the end game setup, but just for the sake of the explaining this, you'll see this character has 40,000 ES. What ends up happening is you take a skill gem like Energy Blade, which says, hey, I'm going to remove some of your ES, but I'm going to give you a big flat weapon. So that's step one. Turn on Energy Blade. Our big 38,000 ES becomes 25. Then you look at the weapon, and it says 500 to 10,000. What elemental weapon in the game has anywhere close to this much flat? None. It's not comparable in the game state. And then you take it a step further, and you say, I'm going to grab something called Battle Mage, something that's built into the Inquisitor Ascendancy. You attach all this flat damage to a spell. It goes further than that, though, because you have Spellblade support, which says, hey, if you have a one-handed weapon, you now get 140% from that one-handed weapon onto your spell. So I take this weapon, I grab 240% of the base damage of this weapon, and it gets attached to the spell. But it doesn't even stop there, because skills have effectiveness. For example, let's just say... Ball Lightning and Eye of Winter aren't a good example to explain this. Let's just do Crackling Lance of Disintegration, for example. 240% effectiveness. You take 240% of this number, which gives you like 24k flat, average it out to 12k, 13k on average. Then you take this skill and you multiply that number by 2.4 because of the effectiveness of the added damage. Granted, other skills like Eye of Winter, you might say, hey, this is only 55 effectiveness, which is true, that's a low number, but it hits a ton of times. So the additional hits makes up for the low effectiveness. The point I'm trying to make is you grab this huge flat number attached to your skill, all of a sudden you have big base flat. Then the other parts of Inquisitor that are really cool in scaling are things like Iron Will, where you have a bunch of strength investment you do throughout the tree, which helps you get your ES investment. This then gives you a bunch of percent damage. So those two things pair one-to-one together. As you scale your strength, you scale your ES number, which gives you bigger flat, and you get percent damage while scaling it. Then you have other things like the Anoint Tranquility, which gives percent damage based on how much percent ES scaling you have. Throughout the min-max process of the build, you end up getting a lot of percent ES into the character, which makes this give a lot of percent damage. Then you have other things like a min-max option. If you really want to take it in min-max investment, then you get the damage per int, but that's a late game thing. I'll showcase before that you use Wrathpith, which gives you a bunch of percent damage as well. So you get percent damage scaling while scaling your ES, and on top of that, Inquisitor then caps your crit and allows you to ignore res via these nodes here. So it just has all this really synergistic scaling that just stacks on top of each other, and that's why it's so efficient. Now, sorry, I just got distracted by that with the E-Blade stuff, but that's why Battle Mage E-Blade is so strong. As for leveling, I give a brief example of some skills you can go for initially. You can also watch the leveling run if you want to see how I did it. I did about a 4-hour campaign run. It was about 350, I think. I'm not the best campaign leveler, but I'm getting better. I've been practicing on it and improving, so take that how you will, but it is a solid initial campaign run. And then after that, as far as getting your first bit of gear, I think this is just what I would do no matter what build I'm playing. which is I recommend doing demolition contracts for about 10 to 30 minutes, depending on how high of investment you want to be. This is one of those things where I think it just smooths out a Leaguestart. You could just go straight into the maps with this character. I think at some point during this VOD, somebody asked me to just, hey, showcase what a tier 1 map looks like. It's completely fine taking this leveling build and just going straight into maps and farming more currency there and then upgrading it throughout that. But I like the idea of spend 10 to 30 minutes doing demo contracts, which gives you raw chaos very consistently, and just get yourself some nice little initial upgrades and just power spike, which just makes you just completely destroy those early maps. So then you're way more efficient in the early maps and you're just having a really good time. So that's what I recommend doing. All you have to do is at around level 60, start checking the heist vendor. You pick up the, whenever you see the rogue marker chest, you pick it up, pick up the rogue markers, pick up the contracts, and buy demo contracts. Or you can also do lockpicking contracts from the vendor. And that being said, when you are, every time you level, the vendor will reset. So if you check the vendor, he doesn't have a demo contract or a lockpicking contract, that's okay. Just leave the area. Next time you level, revisit it. He'll have a new vendor window and you can buy those. So that's what I'd recommend doing. Speaking of which, for the gearing, I have a buy order list that goes over all the basic early items along with some of the early transition items and some of the late game options as well, which you can use with weighted sum searches to help you get your early gear without too much difficulty. So that's what this is right here. It's a buy order list, just going over some of the basic stuff I'd recommend. When you look at this gear, is any of these early uniques required? No, they're not. The reason I have them on here is because when you're looking to get some early game power spiking, very decent rares aren't really readily available on the market, but what are readily available on the market is super cheap uniques, like T5 uniques that have some decent stats. For example, let's say you need a 5-link. A 5-link on a decent base early on doesn't really exist for a reasonable price, but you know what does exist for like 1 chaos? Khaleesi's Grace. It's faster casting. It isn't your best in slot 5-link, but it's pretty much a 5-link, and it's comes with some decent life and some decent ES. It's a great starter item. I always recommend this for like a self-cast build. Very good, once unique, get you your 5-link. You know, it's just something about spiking your power early on with some cheap items. If you look at the rarity tiers of uniques, Broken Crown's a T5, Joffrey's a T4, Khaleesi's a T5, Leper's is a T5, and what those things mean is it just means they're very common. They're going to be on trade for about 1 cast. Out of all of these, the one that might be a little bit expensive is Leper's Alms, because it's in every Peaconk POB, because it's really efficient for Peaconk. You can easily just get yourself a rare ES-based shield if this is more expensive. The other thing that factors into how much of the item is readily available on trade early on is what level it is, because that generally dictates what level it can drop at. So for example, Broken Crown's like 50-ish, Joffrey's is 50-ish to 60-ish, Khaleesi's is like 30-ish or something, and Leper's is like 66. What that means is the time it takes for that item to start like appearing on trade is delayed based on how many people have reached that level of zone for that item to start dropping. So something like Leper's Alm, although it's a T5, just like Broken Crown is a T5, this is going to be rarer on trade because it's going to take longer for people to get to that level of zone in order for that item to start dropping. So T5s, the lower level the T5 is, the cheaper it is going to be on trade. And ultimately, regardless of all this, these are just placeholder items. Just rare hybrid ES items are just going to be better than these. I just think early on, rare hybrids aren't going to exist. For example, like the good 84 bases, they're not going to exist early on, whereas Broken Crown's going to be on trade for 1 chaos, you know? So that's why I recommend these as the early gear swaps. They're not mandatory by any stretch, so don't feel like you need to have them. It's just something I say, hey, if you're trying to do your early gearing, this is what you go for. After which we have the mid-game gearing. This is going to have some variation in it. I'm going to show 3 setups today, and you can look through the loadout configurations. I have self-cast, I have the tristack, and I have the cast and crit setup. You'll notice a bit of tweaking of gearing, and I'll highlight the main differences. But ultimately, it follows pretty much the same formula of Ivory, Tower, Shaper's Touch, Attribute, Gear, that sort of thing. And then late game, I have a little bit of a late game thing, but I don't have the Uber end game stuff, which is also in the gearing of the loadout. This is just more of, hey, a bit more min-max in terms of the part where you're still Ivory Tower before you think about going the CI full ES chest angle. So that's what that stuff is. I go a bit over Mana Solutions, how Eternal Youth works. And for the snack tier list, we had a few additions. I moved Cheez-Its down from S tier because, quite frankly, I haven't been seeing Cheez-Its in my pantry recently, and that's a bit of an issue. And we have been on a bit of a Popeyes kick, and I added it to A tier. Ultimately, tier list for the snacks mostly the same as it was last league. Alrighty, so that goes over the notes. As for the loadouts, you can adjust them, configure them. I don't like configuring POBs because I think it's a bit of a he said, she says battle. Doesn't really matter. I care about in-game examples, and that's what I'm going to show you today. So you can do that if you really care, and the loadouts and all the gear sets are here for your viewing pleasure. Now, let's go ahead and showcase. I'll start with the initial early game mapping setup. We have, I gotta look through all these characters to make sure I find the right one. You see an E-Blade leveling map test character, this level 75 character. Editor Lance here because I forgot a very important detail to go over, which is the changes coming to the self-cast version of the build. Specifically, Arcane Righteous Fire Devotion and Flame Blast buffs and Arcane Surge buffs. This character right now, what I'm going to showcase you today, I think is going to deal quite a bit less damage than what we will have on Leaguestart, because Flame Blast's Celerity is getting like a 25% more damage buff, Arcane Surge is getting 10% more, and Arcane Righteous Fire Devotion is getting 24% more cast speed. All those stacked together, this character would deal like 70% more damage, something like that. I'm not 100% sure. You can do the math if you really care. But the reason we can run Righteous Fire of Arcane Devotion on this early basic setup is because Righteous Fire of Arcane Devotion, its degen is 100% contingent on your mana pool, not your life and ES pool. So if you have a small mana pool, that means you can run this and have a very little degen to counter while getting the big 24% more cast speed. So with just a Kikazaro or an Immortal Flesh or a rare belt with the regen mod, any of those things will work. Joffrey's Sanctuary gives us Zealot's Oath, which allows that to fully sustain us on our ES pool. Ultimately, later on in the character, you will be grabbing Zealot's Oath. So it's a bit of a pairing of Zealot's Oath, regen, plus life flasks on life pool, and it works out quite well. Okay. Now that I cut that in correctly, I'm just going to showcase a map real quick here. This is a T8 desert. We are a level 76, 75 character. I don't have a passive spec, but that's okay. It doesn't matter. I just want to showcase the early game. Let's say you got to maps. This is what the gameplay would look like. Hopefully we can showcase that. You'll notice my AoE changes throughout. You'll notice my Righteous Fire randomly increased in AoE there, and then it decreased. That is because this right here, Fanaticism charges. Is this guy not dead? Okay, sorry, I wanted to describe this real quick. Fanaticism charges. The way this works is, as I shield charge around, I generate Fanaticism charges, and then it'll proc a 4-second buff that gives you a bunch of cast speed, 75% more cast speed, a bunch of reduced cost, which means you can sustain it with no problem, and a bunch of AoE. Feels very good from my playtest in maps. I ended up getting won over by it. I was always kind of a Fanaticism kind of hater, but to be honest, with the self-casting quiz, it honestly feels like a pretty good node. So I wanted to highlight that in case you're wondering throughout this map why stuff like that is happening. Another thing I want to make note of is I was planning, do I have a remove burn on here? Okay, well, I guess we're just not going to have Arcane Devotion on because I'm going to keep removing burn every time I click Mana Flask, and I don't want to have to keep remembering to press it. But anyways, I completely lost my train of thought. I think I was talking about Fanaticism. I was always kind of a hater of Fanaticism, but when I started playing with it, this run, I have to say it felt pretty dang good, especially with Flame Blast's Celerity, which already has like good base AoE. Because it just feels like you're just hitting the entire screen. You're just blowing up all these packs, and it feels pretty punchy. So stuff like that is kind of nice, and I end up enjoying it quite a bit. You can make your own mind up whether or not you think the Fanaticism is worth it. You can make your own decisions. But I felt like it was pretty dang worth from my like testing or whatever you want to call it. That all being said, I go over it later on, I think, in this video because it's Editor Lance. But the biggest unknown factor for this character is the time frame between basically, you know, white maps to yellow maps, farming your initial few divines. I think it'll be good. I think it'll be decent. I don't think it'll be anything super exceptional for going into red maps. I think maybe it will be, it'll be good enough to farm that initial currency, but your big power spike is contingent on those first few pieces of gear where you really start to rock and roll, and then every upgrade after that feels incredible. Another thing that I haven't been doing because I keep forgetting about it is in this setup, I have a 4-link Tornado of Turbulence on Unleash. I feel like this feels pretty good, and you can make up your mind if you think it's worth the extra cast time, but we already have We have a lot of extra sockets with this initial setup, so I felt like it was like worth it to take the time to cast that for the extra like single target on a boss, and that's what it looks like killing the boss. But yeah, this is your really basic cheapo gear, level 76 or 75 because I don't have the passive spec, going into a tier 8 map. Anyways, now we can cut back to the rest of the showcase because I just forgot to go over the changes that happened to Flame Blast Celerity. Ultimately, you can use a different skill, but instead of Flame Blast, you could use something like Firestorm Pelting, or you could use some of the Spell Echo skills that got buffed. For example, the Wave of Conviction, Charthus Wave of Conviction, that with less duration support, if it makes it go in and out fast enough within the cast time where you can keep proccing it, that might just be a go-to. So you're gonna want to try out some skills, see what you like, but Flame Blast Celerity I thought was the best, and you get the currency to buy it on trade. Do not run lab for this, just do some demo contracts, get some chaos, and buy it on trade. So yeah, anyways, back to the rest of the video. For one, I will go ahead and showcase the self-cast setup with Flame Blast Celerity, just give you some contrast of what this looks like between the, oh, I'm level 75 and I have some potato gear, versus the, I am now level 95 and I am self-cast Flame Blast with now the Ivory Tower swap. This gearing is mostly targeting a bit of cast speed and some okay attributes. Ultimately, you'd want to get quite a bit better gear than I have here, but this is just the stuff to get you started, to get you initially playing, and we'll showcase let's do a random Guardian. I like the Minotaur showcase personally, it's one I'm a big fan of. This one has Possessed as well, so we'll just see how that goes. The good old Possessed showcase. This is it is what it is. One thing I'll say as well, you'll notice right now I'm wearing Tri-Res Flask. I want to make a note of this because specifically you can play the Flask setup a few different options. One is you can go Tri-Res, which is a good, where you get max res. It's a decent tank option because elemental damage is usually generally the most dangerous thing in the game. Another option is you can do Bismuth plus Quicksilver plus Res Flask, or you could even go, I don't know if I'd do Silver plus Quicksilver or Silver plus Bismuth, maybe, depending on how your res gearing is, but those are options as well, to allow you for potentially, probably shouldn't be clicking shrines on accident, that while I'm thinking about it, I'll try and have random buffs. I kind of forget about that stuff. But yeah, anyways, as I was saying, I like doing Bismuth Quicksilver plus just the core scanning. That gives you, you lose the max res, but it allows you to go Quicksilver and be a little bit faster. I'm going to showcase all different setups because my cast on crit setup has a Bismuth plus Quicksilver. I think my mine setup might have triple res. Ultimately, it's a personal preference thing, I think. So that's kind of up to you. But yeah, that's what it looks like. Self-cast setup on a Possessed Minnow. Editor Lance here because I forgot again to go over specifically how are we sustaining the flasks. It's something I have done in a lot of different builds that I keep forgetting that it's something that needs to be explained, which is Ivory Tower plus Balbala plus Coruscating Elixir. How does this interaction work? Ivory Tower says, hey, if you have a bunch of life and you reserve that life, you then get a bunch of energy shield. The thing is though, when you reserve all your life for that energy shield and you do blood magic, how are you defending against chaos damage? Pretty simple. You use this flask right here, Coruscating Elixir. Chaos damage cannot bypass during the flask effect. You add in a Balbala Brutal Restraint jewel. This says Brutal Restraint with a denoted service Balbala line. That will make this Keystone the Trader, which gives you flash charges every 5 seconds based on how many empty flask slots you have. The easy go-to is 2 empty flask slots for no mana or no flask investment. If you want to go for a 4th flask, you have to start picking up some flask nodes. So that's kind of up to you if you want to force it in. I don't really think it's worth it generally, but you can make that choice yourself. And so yeah, that's how you deal with chaos damage. Just cutting in because I forgot to go over that because I don't know why, but here you go. Showcasing the cast on crit variation, which I'm just gonna make sure I can find it because took a lot of time to set up all these versions of the builds. Okay, here, we'll do the mine version first because I have it right in front of me. This is the mine version. This is the tristack variation. I will include the tristack specific POB, but you can also use the POB for the overall guide. The pros of doing the tristack is you get to go suppressed. Right now we have 74 suppressed. That's basically from our decks and these 3 nodes alone. As you upgrade the character, this suppression will literally get capped just from dex investment. If you really want to get the suppress cap early, you can spec like this passive point, and go here. That works as well if you want to cap your suppress early on. So the one advantage of the tristack is you get to go suppress fairly easily. And then the other advantage is you get to use skills that work well with mines or mine-specific skills. Previously, we always recommended Hex Blast of Contradiction. Since that took a huge nerf, we've been showcasing other versions. I will showcase a Ball Lightning of Orbiting in maps. We'll do another Minotaur showcase just so we can have all the comparisons of builds side by side. And we'll see how this goes. This says gain chaos, gain cold. I think we should be fine to run something like that, but we can do a Minnow showcase on mines, then we'll do a cast on crit showcase, and then we'll do the Giga Chad showcase just to give you the ability of what you can do with it. So, for example, this is if we did Ball Lightning of Orbiting. Ball Lightning of Orbiting, from my testing, maybe 20 to 30% less damage than Eye of Winter, something like that. It's definitely less damage than Eye of Winter, but it's a nice all-rounder skill where you just throw it and you like see how these things orbit around, and they have a radius and they have an AoE. So it's like super, like, pretty solid for clear in terms of like if you want an in-betweener that has good single target and good clear. Ball Lightning of Orbiting I think is fantastic for that. If you wanted to go like pure clear and you want to just improve that, you could go something like Arc, for example, but Arc will have worse single target. This is kind of like where personal preference and what type of like strategy you're farming, what thing you're going for, that sort of thing matters a lot for that. This is the Res Flasks setup. Cast and Crit setup has the... Dude, I need to take off these buffs. My brain's just not even like... forgetting that I shouldn't be having those on. But this is what Ball Lightning looks like on a Minotaur. I should have Immortal Called there, but I kind of forgot to. Is what it is. That is a Minotaur, by the way, slamming with 100 gain is extra and 40% gain is extra. And still tanked it just fine. So that is what that looks like on mines. And I'll hover over the gear really briefly here just so you can see it. This is, of course, mines on a 6-link. The big thing I'd say, the difference between cast on crit and self-cast and mines, is I felt like cast on crit on a 5-link was already pretty dang good damage. Ultimately, you could play all of these on a 5-link. One thing I would say is you do not need a 6-link to do the swap. Prioritize getting all the main items to do the swap before prioritizing a 6-link. Because a 6-link can almost, you know, it has 3-4 divines in just 6-link cost alone. I'd much rather recommend get the basic setup going, do a 5-link, and then just send it, because that swap will feel oh so good. Editor Lance cutting in because it's a good time to talk about when you should buy items and rough cost of things. This isn't like 100% drawn to scale, but it should give you a relative idea of how things work and when you should be buying gear pieces. For example, boss drops and semi-rare items are things that will start off higher price and go down. Things like Brutal Restraint has a dropper condition of doing Timeless Domain Conflict and the Balbala boss, the rarest one, the yellow one, the Azneth people. Wrathpith is a T2 unique. It's relatively rare to start out with, but it will get saturated because not a ton of builds use it. You have Crown of the Inward Eye, restricted to a Cirrus drop. You have Shaper's Touch, Cyclopean Coil, restricted to Elder and Shaper respectively. These are items that initially there's just not a lot of supply. There's a lot of builds that want them, so they start off kind of high. You do not want to buy these as your first purchases. These are things that you buy them and you will lose money each hour that passes. The item will go down in value type of thing. And then there's things that you should buy early on that will go up in value. A good example is rare jewels. When everybody goes through the campaign, there are multiple quests that give you a rare jewel. What this means is when you have thousands of players in the campaign, each one of them is generating a few different quest rewards with rare jewels. And also on top of that, no one has currency. And jewels are one of those things where there's a very high likelihood the jewel could be decent for somebody else, but not you, which means most of these jewels, they go straight on a trade and you can pick up, I kid you not, 4 to 3 stat jewels very consistently at around 10 save. Pretty much every league I've ever played, I could get very good jewels for my build in the range of 10 to 20 chaos. And it's a great time to be looking at those upgrades because there's things you can pop in with the initial scuffed version of the character that will gain value and be useful for you later on. So that's one thing I'd recommend investing into early for those early upgrades, something that will apply to both the scuff setup early on and your late game setup, something that's cheap early, but it goes way more expensive later on. Another example of this would be things like basic good rare jewelry. This has kind of a plateau effect where it ends up getting close to like one divine for a good rare ring, but it just ends up tanking off afterwards because things like people start min-maxing and start going for fractured items or helicals or recombinated rings or influenced rings, depending on what type of build or what type of things they need, or unique jewelry like the taming. One of those things where it kind of plateaus and then goes back down. So depending on where you are in progression, that is one thing I would look at and consider for which things you're going to purchase. And then things like Coruscant Elixir, this is drop restricted to a div card. So initially it just doesn't exist, especially if it's not on a Never Sinks filter. So if there's a limited supply of this, it's because people just haven't gotten to the map that drops the div card, but it's a very common div card. You can practically SSF farm this very easily if you need to, ultimately. It'll get flooded on the market pretty quick and it'll tank in value. So that's just going over some of the basic items. Ooh, one more thing I should talk about that's very important that I didn't mention yet is Ivory Tower plus tailoring orbs. Ivory Tower specifically is pretty cheap for a good roll early on. And then as you progress in the league, those min-max rolls get a little bit more expensive, maybe 20, 30, 40C, something along those range. I'm talking like a 68 or higher int roll on the Ivory Tower. You care about the int roll, by the way. That's the most important roll on that item. And then things like tailoring orbs, you'll notice in every single one of these showcases, I showcased the 8% defense enchant. You might say, Lance, that's super expensive. How could I afford that? The reason you can afford that is because every single league, tailoring orb initially is cheap as hell. Roughly in the range of 20 to 30 to 40 chaos. I'm talking one divine buys you 5 of them. And the thing about the 8% defense enchant, I've done a lot of tailoring orbs. It's like a 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 to hit. It will be like one divine, roughly an investment to add to your character to buy those initial orbs to put 8% defense enchant, but it gives you like 8% more ES. It's always worth to do this early on. Put that on your Ivory Tower, especially doing it before you link it, because another factor that comes into play with the Ivory Tower, if you already have it 6 linked, tailoring orb can brick the 6 link. So you want a tailoring orb before you put money into fusings to 6 link it, because the 6 link costs a hell of a lot more than doing the 8% defense enchant. Just make sure you do that first. So anyways, cutting back to the rest of the video, just wanted to explain roughly the idea of what items you should be looking for early on. You want to buy your rare jewels, your good Ivory Tower, your tailoring orbs. Those are the things you want to invest into early. And then later on, after like a day or two, you want to start looking at the Brutal Restraint, the Wrathpith, and those other items. Certain items just cost more initially, and they tank in value. Certain items cost less. Buy when you are at an advantageous state in terms of this rough graft. This isn't going to 100% one-to-one replicate what happens in League, but it gives you a good idea. Anyways, back to the rest of the video. This is the early showcase setup of a level 95 roughly character with a 5 link. Cover a bit of the gear here so you can see it. One thing to notice about cast on crit versus self-cast versus mines is cast on crit, there's a very important breakpoint of 14% CDR. You can get this from a benchcraft plus 1 boot implicit, or you can get this from a benchcraft plus a couple abyssal jewels with CDR. You just need to hit 14% for that first breakpoint. And then that is just fine for CDR. You're chilling on CDR all the way until you're looking at min-max upgrading, in which case you need Awaken Cast on Crit, in my opinion, to go for that 52 CDR breakpoint, which eventually you will get to the point of doing. Now let's go ahead and showcase what this looks like on a Eater for a 5 link. I think I have Eye of Winter in. This is some of the... I think from my testing, Cast on Crit was, I want to say, the strongest of the single target skills I tested, versus the mines versus the self-cast. Mines were maybe fairly comparable, and self-cast with the buffs might start to be more competitive as well, but either way, you're going to be able to do pretty much whatever content you want. The damage should be plenty there. I will say one thing about this early setup of cast on crit, one thing I would change or try to prioritize a little bit more is get a bit of attack speed. My attack speed is just a little bit... Okay, it's a bit too slow in my opinion. I'd say you want to get maybe 20-30% attack speed would make this feel a lot smoother. In the Giga Chad setup, I'm running haste and it feels fantastic, where the attack speed just feels so much more smooth. That's something I would say I would look into, do a little bit differently than what I have here. Now I want to talk about tree setups that I haven't talked about too much here on the different variations. You'll notice I have a setup that paths this way This is the showcase what your pathing should be when swapping to split personality. I don't have this in this character yet because this is just a basic cheap setup. But when you do swap to split personality, you want this. Initially, maybe just pathing out this way is fine. Or with the self-cast example, I path up and over this way to go more block focus. Because with self-cast, I decided to run haste instead of grace plus ghost dance. In the mine setup and the cast and crit setup, I have grace plus ghost dance. So it kind of depends. You can feel out and change different things around how you want to play. If you want to go more speed, you can go haste. You're going to lose a lot of tank in terms of avoidance layers with this stuff, but you're going to pick up a lot of speed. That's kind of your choice on how you want to do it. So look at each of the 3 trees. There's a little bit of variation depending on tristack. You go over here and do a little bit more pathing like this. Caster, or self-cast, I went this way, went block and dropped this stuff so I could go haste for more speed and feels good movement. And this setup, I have basically the tree pathing is based on when we'll swap to split personalities, which will be here in the gem sockets. I have it prepared for that. Ultimately, you could just pack these 2 nodes and save some nodes here if you wanted to be a little bit more efficient, but I wanted to showcase the different possible tree variations you could go for. Alrighty. Last, but certainly not least, I want to showcase a min-max example I threw together. This is in no way, shape, or form min-maxed. I didn't spend very long to try to like perfect the setup. This is just, I wanted to let people know you don't need to stay Ivory Tower. You don't need to stay coruscating. The build scales fantastically. When you start min-maxing it, you can equip a Mage Blood. You can equip the feels good defenses, the feels good speed. It has that progression layer. I don't think people realize that, or I didn't really explain that well on the last guide, and I want to showcase that, and that's why I threw this together. This tree spent not that long min-maxing, so there's probably a lot of room for error where you could improve upon this, and I'd recommend you do that. If you end up playing this character, I'm sure there's a better way or more min-max way to do it, but I just want to preface that is the reason I want to show this is so that way people know you don't have to stay coruscating, you don't have to stay Ivory. When you're min-maxing and you're getting those better upgrades, you can really, really pop off with going to pure ES gear like a Twilight Regalia. Another thing I want to note is people will probably ask about this. In this POB, I have Sanctuary of Thought. And you might be saying, Lance, you've tested this character with Sanctuary of Thought, which is losing the 50% less cost. How are you going to sustain the mana? And I will go over that right now. Number 1 is Sanctuary of Thought, also the reservation. In this character, I have a bunch of extra reservation I don't need. And that's why we don't have this unreserved, is because I'm planning for that reservation being removed. And then as for the cast on crit and the mana sustain, certain skills have mana scaling based on, number 1, their level. So the first example is something like Eye of Winter. Its effectiveness does not change between level 1 and level 20. So what you can do is you just take the skill and you de-level it. That's option number 1, where you cut the cost in half literally by just using level 1 instead of level 20. It changes the damage almost not at all, because all of your base damage is from your E-Blade. 95% of your damage is your E-Blade. So going from level 20 to level 1 will like a 5% damage loss. It doesn't really matter. Another option is you can run Inspiration Support. Depending on the setup, Inspiration Support can or cannot work, but for the most part, this is another good option. Option number 3 is for the fact that this character gets 1% mana regen instead of the 50% less cost, which is actually quite sizable. Your base mana regen starts at a 1.8%, so adding another 1% base is over, I think it's like 60% more mana regen. So it almost makes up for the less cost by that mod alone. So there's some tweaking you can do. I just want to let you all know that depending on what skill you're using, you might have to tweak the mana a little bit, but it shouldn't really be much of an issue, especially if you use a lot of the skills that have good scaling at level 1. For example, Eye of Winter, Blade Fall, Ball Lightning of Orbiting, a lot of those skills have good scaling at level 1. Right now we have Crackling Lance of Dissipation. You can use pretty much whatever skills you want on this. It doesn't really matter. We'll go ahead and do, Cigarette's kind of a boss has a stall phase. We'll do Fortress, because Fortress doesn't have stall phases. And this looks like this map has basically what will be 100% suppressed. So this will be like a half damage map. We ignore res, so that mod doesn't matter. Temporal Chains is annoying, but we're just going to run it anyways. And we'll showcase what this character looks like. Take whatever skill you want, socket it in, and it will be a good time. This is Disintegration. You can use whatever skill you really want. Disintegration's, I think, just a mid-tier skill. It's got okay effectiveness, but there's just better options if you want to talk single target. And one other funny thing is you might notice throughout the showcase of the various characters is your Lancing Steel of spraying actually deals like kind of a ton of damage. Funnily enough, I think on my tooltip, I think I have about 1 million plus tooltip on just my Lancing Steel of spraying. So like if you look at yeah, if you look at the tooltip, it's just like 2 million damage on the Lancing Steel of spraying, which is just kind of funny considering we're cast on crit build. But that also probably should showcase, hey, the scaling is super generic and super crazy. Even if I wanted to, you could make this into an attack-based character and it would just work. And considering that's 2 million tooltip on effectively a 3-link, right? Awaken, cast on crit, inspiration, and crit damage. Yeah, there's 3 relevant supports here. Cast on crit, not really. So it's just a 3-link. Inspiration plus crit damage for the Lancing Steel Sprain. So anyways. Oh, one other thing I want to say about this setup. I chucked this together. One thing I will say is if you really want to go extra tank, this setup I did not really go min-max tank. You could swap out Zealotry and do Flesh and Stone plus Arctic to really ramp up your fizz and your max hit. Another thing I will say is I started becoming really settled towards the end of this. Some of the gear pieces are basically I just yoinked from previous builds I made. And for example, this shield should have like spell block, but I just settled on it because I didn't want to keep crafting because I wanted to get this guide out. And so there's things that you should improve upon this character from what this version has here that will help out the defenses a lot. Things like getting the block on there. If you want to swap out Zealotry because you don't need the damage, Flesh and Stone, Arctic Armor will feel great, stuff like that. Alrighty. So that should cover, unless I forgot some things, that should cover. I should have showcased all the different variations of the build along with the early setup, give you an idea of how to league start this build and then how to progress it all the way from starting from the humble beginnings of Act 1. I may have forgotten some stuff to cover. Ultimately, I stream pretty much every day. Feel free to come by and ask me questions if you have questions about how to craft gear and stuff like that. But this should cover most questions, I would think. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this update guide to the Energy Blade Inquisitor. As always, thanks for watching, Exiles. Take care and peace out.